Hi, I'm Jamie from Chegg Tutors. Today I want to talk to you about creative nonfiction, a genre we might consider relatively new that's really been around for a long time. Some other things you might hear this called is new journalism when it's applied to journalists. We see long form pieces like in the magazine N+1, The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, or even the New York Times Magazine, and we see the genre of the personal essay, which has been around since Montaigne in many years ago, many centuries ago, but also has continued to the present day in authors like Joan Didion, Annie Dillard, who are really combining examining the outside world and examining the personal connection to it and the inside world. Creative nonfiction is really characterized by applying poetic or narrative fiction techniques, but still writing nonfiction. It's not just the facts. Instead, it might have a nonlinear sequence where it has flashbacks or flash forwards. It's really a human interest story a lot of the time, so you get character development, descriptive language, and metaphor and imagery, especially for technical things or very complicated concepts that the author wants to convey in a compelling and clear way. There are a lot of authors, modern contemporary authors, that use this form, but I want to tell you about some of them who do a wide variety of things. So, for example, John McPhee, who we'll see a little bit later, has a long series of books about the geological history of the United States, where he met a geologist at Princeton and traveled the whole country with him, learning geology and trying to understand and weave this with history and human interest, the story of the geologist himself. He's written about star college basketball players and even a book about oranges. And in each case, he says he's really interested in people who are experts and who have a compelling life story. So he really likes to meet someone, delve into everything about their life, their personal life, and also their connection to their work. Very difficult work, or maybe obscure work, that he still finds very interesting. As a creative nonfiction writer, he has the unique ability to structure a narrative over the length of a novel or even a series of novels while writing nonfiction, even about very technical subjects. Someone who wrote a long time ago would be James Agee, and he wrote Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. This is about the Great Depression. He worked with a photographer and took photos of people, especially in the Dust Bowl, but all over the country. He took a series of famous photos of people, especially those most hard hit by the Great Depression, and he wrote a narrative to go along with these photos, really trying to illuminate the lives of ordinary people. That's what a lot of creative nonfiction does, is do journalism that's the stories of people who don't make it into the mainstream just the facts news. Other people would be people like Bill Bryson, The History of Everything. Joan Didion, who's really writing more personal essays, some of them about loss or grief, that still have a connection to the cultural milieu of the time. Barbara Ehrenreich, who writes Nickel and Dimed, embeds herself as a poor person for a while, the working poor, and says how the unique situation of the working poor is in the United States through the lens, again, of embedding herself as a character in other people's narrative. A famous one would be Truman Capote, who writes In Cold Blood about a murder. It's essentially a murder mystery, but about a murder that really happened and the ensuing investigation. Things like The Laramie Project, which is a play based on the murder of Matthew Shepard, where again they interviewed everyone in the town who initially were very unwilling, but eventually were more willing to talk to them, and told a story that might not have been told otherwise. That highlights another key element of creative nonfiction. There's a lot of research that goes into it, just like, quote, regular nonfiction, and it's really about building trust with the people you interview so that you really get those more personal stories and things that they may feel more vulnerable about telling. You have people who are funnier too, like David Sedaris, the comedian and comic writer. Not actual comics, but he's funny. Or people like David Foster Wallace, who died a few years ago, who writes hilarious essays in collections like Consider the Lobster or A Funny Story you never want to hear again. And these people, again, are writing about topics as diverse as the fishing industry or what it's like with a lot of old people on long cruise ship tour, or tennis. And David Foster Wallace especially was obsessed with star tennis players. And again, you see something about creative nonfiction where David Foster Wallace used to be a junior tennis player when he was younger, and he develops this interest in a very personal way. So it is nonfiction, but it comes from a very personal place, and the place not just of the people you're interviewing, but also the author himself or herself. Now that's been an introduction and a lot of folks that do this creative nonfiction writing. But let's look at some specific examples. This is an excerpt from James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son, written during the Harlem Renaissance. And I want us to look at the imagery, the metaphors, and really the intense pathos feeling in this passage. This was the time of what was called the brownout, when the lights in all American cities were very dim. When we re-entered the street, something happened to me which had the force of an optical illusion or a nightmare. Now stop there. What is an optical illusion or a nightmare conjure, and how are those two things related? Using fiction techniques, or really poetry techniques, where he chooses very specific language, instead of saying, something happened to me that I could never forget, or something happened to me that was truly terrible, he uses these careful choice of words to show his mental state. Not only was it a horrible thing and put him almost out of his mind, but it was as if he was in a dream state, and he's going to tell the rest of the story from this point of view. Let's keep going. The streets were very crowded, and I was facing north to freedom, if we want to think of it that way. People were moving in every direction, but it seemed to me, in that instant, that all of the people I could see, and many more than that, were moving toward me, against me, and that everyone was white. Again, he's really creating an image for us and putting us in that intense emotion, in that intense image. Again, with careful language. He said, moving towards me, and then he inserts an emotion word. He flips it and says, against me. Not just against by motion, but also against in his sense of these people's hatred towards him. I remember how their faces gleamed, and I felt like a physical sensation, a click at the nape of my neck, as though some interior string connecting my head to my body had been cut. Again, we see an image that's kind of incongruous, but we really get a sense that it was experienced as a physical sensation, as a physical, almost act of violence in his body. And so even though we have this image, because it's so strange and so unusual for our memoir, we really focus in on this image and try and understand it. And that's what creative nonfiction does, is try and not just have us skim things like we might in regular nonfiction, but every detail, every image is important. Let's look at something from John McPhee's Oranges book, which I mentioned earlier. This passage is less about memoir, less about the personal, and more about taking a very technical subject and turning it understandable and vivid. He's describing here an inline extractor, a machine used in orange juicing. Now, I bet you have no idea what that is, and neither did I when I first read this, but I got a really good sense, a good picture, and a good sense of the force of this machine from this description. It has a shining row of aluminum jaws, upper and lower, with shining aluminum teeth. When an orange tumbles in, the upper jaw comes crunching down on it, while at the same time the orange is penetrated from below by a perforated steel tub. As the jaws crush the outside, the juice goes through the perforations in the tube and down into the plumbing of the concentrate plant. All in a second, the juice has been removed and the rind has been crushed and shredded beyond recognition. Now you'd think this was the story of like a gruesome murder or something. We get verbs like penetrated, crushed, removed, again crushed, shredded beyond recognition. We get the sense of the motion of the orange through the machine. The orange tumbles in, the upper jaw comes crunching down, it's perforated, the jaws crush the outside. We get where the juice goes, where the rind goes, and where it ends up. So he could have showed us a picture of this, a very technical diagram. It would have been like, how does this work? Again, it's almost like we're seeing a video of this orange, and we're also getting a sense of the kind of awesome power of this and what could be seen as the violence of this machine. that's not just, an orange machine, a machine for crushing oranges, but it really has a crucial role in this process, even though we have no idea what the process is as a whole, or even some of the technical details here. There's vocabulary we don't understand. Still, with the use of the verbs very carefully, with the use of the imagery, intensifying language, you get a really good sense of what this machine does. You could have just said just the facts, but we probably would not have understood, and that's one of the functions of creative nonfiction. Now, with this introduction to several authors that do creative nonfiction, and also a look at some detailed passages that are creative nonfiction, I hope you have a better sense now of what this genre is and what it can do.